Hello, I'm Deborah Woroff from MECFS Alert, and today I'm on the shores of Lake Tahoe in Incline Village talking to the father of chronic fatigue syndrome medicine, Dan Peterson, who was here practicing medicine in Tahoe some 25 years ago when we had our first recognized U.S. outbreak of the disease. And he's been with us, holding up the flag, fighting for us, researching for us, bravely, I should add, ever since. Although he does have the fortune to be doing it in one of the most beautiful places on earth. Dan, I want to go through some of your treatments. You've been very aggressive about putting treatments forward for your patients, trying not only to learn but to win from the very beginning. And of course, you're known for having worked with Ampligen for a long time and for being an advocate for it. How many patients do you think you have on it now, and how many do you think you've had through it?
In Ampligen, I have about 28 people on it right now, and a total of about 300.
Yeah.
So I think I have more people than any other physician with respect to that drug. With respect to being aggressive, what I found over the years is for the severely disabled patients and even the moderately disabled, unless you exercise and introduce some sort of aggressive treatment, they don't spontaneously recover.
Oh, I think that's true.
Symptomatic therapy can be enormously beneficial. Adjuvant therapy can be enormously beneficial, but they don't recover unless you really attack the etiology and the pathogenesis directly, which I think we stumbled on Ampligen, which is very, very beneficial for a subset of patients.
Right, for the immune deficiencies primarily.
Yes, primarily, yes.
And another one I wanted to ask you about, you've undertaken to deal with Cefidivir, or Vistide is its commercial name.
Yes.
And that is, I understand, from HIV doctors who've used it, one of the most difficult drugs to manage. It has to be given by IV. You have to look out very sharp for possible side effects, and you have a protocol where you give it with another medicine, I believe.
Yes.
Why don't you tell us a little about how you got into this?
I'd be happy to. I have a subset of patients who have evidence of beta herpes virus reactivation, either CMV or HHV6A or B. And for that subset of patients, particularly if they have it in their spinal fluid, they need a very potent antiviral. And for that group of herpes viruses, we're somewhat limited in our armamentarium to a few oral drugs that are not terribly effective, and then to foscarnet, which is very difficult to administer, and Vistide, which is somewhat easier because the infusion is every 2 weeks. I've had treated about 65 people according to this protocol, so relative to the world of chronic fatigue syndrome, that's not very many people. But for those people, they've had very dramatic responses. Some have gone back to work, normal lives, etc.
I think most doctors don't even want to deal with it at all.
Oh, I'm certain that's true. It has to be monitored. You have to monitor kidney function and liver function and white blood counts, etc. And you're right. I don't even think it's generally acknowledged that subsets of these patients are identifiable.
Well, we have had before the Valcyte doing some help with HHV6. Have you used that?
I have used Valcyte, and I followed the protocol from Jose Montoya at Stanford with a long course of therapy. It also has to be monitored very carefully, and it also has significant side effects with headache and nausea, etc.
Would you use it again now that you have the Vistide?
I have used it.
Oh, you are still using it?
Yes.
Yeah. And it seems to me, from my personal experience, that it does good for a while and then falls off. Is that universal? Or is that just me?
With the herpes viruses, since we never really cure them, they go into remission and then they relapse in that group of patients.
And do we have the same pattern with Vistide?
Yes. Most recently, I've been combining therapies with immunoglobulin or Ampligen or other agents, and with some significant success as well.
Oh, really? So if you do both the antipathogen and the immune booster at the same time.
Yes.
And what's the longest you've been able to keep someone really in positive shape using?
So far, 3 or 4 years, but I'm talking about almost total remission.
That's fabulous.
I frequently get asked the question, you know, is this curable? And I can't say that I would say it's curable, but it's certainly able to relieve symptoms such that people can return to work full time, which is pretty dramatic.
And that's with the Vistide combined with immune boosters.
Right.
Yeah, that's very good. And of course, early on, I remember you were very much looking forward to CMX-001, which will eventually someday in the future be a pill. It's in fat. It's encapsulated in fat, and that's supposed to be a very good version of Vistide.
Biopharma is great when they see a market at developing things, and so I look forward to the future of better drugs for all the patients with chronic fatigue, not just the subsets that have immunological abnormalities.
Have you talked to many people in pharma? I don't think they know about us at all.
They're not terribly interested, I think, because they don't really recognize the market potential.
Yeah, aren't there a million of us?
There should be, and I don't think they can't get their hands around a biological marker and endpoints, and all those things are very important when you're trying to interest pharma. And for a drug that's already licensed, there's no incentive for them to do a study in chronic fatigue.
Right, because one could theoretically prescribe it anyway.
Yes.
Yeah, off-label. But are there any other immune booster drugs that you're looking at for the future?
Well, intravenous gamma globulin. A new area I'm really excited about is the cytokine blockers and the immune modulator rituximab, which has gotten a lot of press. And hopefully they'll do a much larger study in the near future on that. My concern about that is I don't know how to predict who will respond.
Yeah.
And it would be nice to have guidelines for, you know, entrance criteria, et cetera, where we could give people an idea of whether or not they would respond.
Yeah, that would be helpful because it's a very expensive initiation, isn't it?
Yes.
Very expensive drug, and with some side effects.
Yes.
Is it very rough or moderate?
It can be,
yeah,
on certain people particularly.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I hope we'll learn something both from Sweden and from, or was it Norway? Norway, and your friends over the mountain at the open.
Where it's being used, yes.
Yeah, where they're working on it. If you had all the money in the world, or thereabouts, where would you be going now with your research and your treatments and everything to do with this disease?
I would invest the money in centers for excellence. And the reason for that is I don't think that primary care physicians can really manage this disease. I think it's too complex, too time consuming, and they have too many other things to do. So, and I've evolved over the years in my thinking about this. I think if we could get primary care physicians to recognize the disease, to qualify the patient, then they have to have some place to refer them to. And I see a great need, actually all around the world, for people to seek specialty care, which is appropriate until it becomes simpler, until it becomes cookbook.
Yeah.
Like HIV is fairly easy to manage right now because you know the diagnosis, you know how to monitor, the drugs are there, the pills are once a day now. I mean, it's become a very manageable disease. But chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, is a long ways from that.
What do you think we need to do now, we being all of the United States government, private foundations, individuals? What do we need to do to get there, to that point of it being
Well, I think it's clear that it's not a homogeneous disease.
You're
And
leading that way.
I think the CDC is correct in trying to understand the subsets
Yeah.
and redefine both biologically and perhaps by symptoms these subsets that then could be entered into clinical trials. And I think things would move along much more quickly if we did that. As far as the universal definition goes, you know, I think that would be enormously helpful, but we seem to have a great deal of difficulty getting there.
What is your sense of what subsets you're seeing here? Do you have a sense of which ones predominate, one or two that seem to be the most common in this region?
Well, there seems to be a real difference between the people who have an acute onset and a slow onset. About 15% of the people I see have active infections of one sort or another, not only HHV6, but EB or CMV or parvovirus. About 1 out of 7, well, they're clearly treatable, so they should be identified. There's the people who have had industrial exposures or heavy metal toxicity or post-vaccination, and those are all post-transfusion. Those are all potentially identifiable subsets that might be best treated differently.
Yeah, and we don't really know yet, but it is a hypothesis.
Yes.
Yeah, and why here? Do you have any sense at all? I know the CDC never tried to find out why God, having given us Lake Tahoe, gave us chronic fatigue syndrome to go with it. And do you still have people coming in at a high rate for it? New patients?
Not locally. The local thing happened and disappeared, and my philosophy is the same it's been for many, many years. Some virus came through this community at that time, striking susceptible people, and then left. I still see a lot of local patients that got sick and have stayed sick.
Of course.
But I mostly see people from distant places that come here.
Because they're desperate and have not been cured by their local doctors.
Yes.
And they hope to be.
Yes.
That's hard. It limits treatment to those who can get here.
It does, unfortunately,
So
which is why I support the idea of Centers for Excellence.
Who would you need to have at a Center for Excellence? In other words, what would your recipe book or kit, you know how Ladies Home Journal used to print kits of how to build your dream house?
Yeah.
What goes in my Center of Excellence?
I understand the question, but execution of it is much more difficult. I think the concept of translational medicine is very good, where you have basic researchers working with clinicians.
Yeah.
In this disease particularly, where there's not a lot of understanding between the scientists and the clinicians, and pharma for that matter, and even laboratories, you know, it's, but it would be doable because there's centers of excellence for breast cancer, for multiple sclerosis, for ALS. I mean, you just go down the list. So you can create that model if there's support for it.
Yeah, so you'd basically have at least one, hopefully more physicians, and at least one, hopefully more researchers, and then
Yes.
PAs and nurses, and
Yes.
I think I can see the shape. Wouldn't major medical centers, major academic centers be a good place to start? Stanford, Duke?
They're traditionally great sources of centers for excellence. However, they operate very slowly. They have very high overhead. They're very difficult to get things like IRB approval and even to recruit staff.
Yeah, that is true. And they, yes, you have to get everything past their committee of ethics,
Et cetera.
Now,
and then funding has been very short term. You know, some people have started these plans and then run out of the startup funds.
Yeah.
So.
Well, speaking of funding, I mean, we're as a disease, we're really getting most of our research funding from rather, for the most part, small pots of private money. Is this a good thing, or would you rather see it go over to government funding should that happen?
I think private funding is very efficient because it can be targeted and it's easier to obtain in some circumstances. But I really do think it's a national problem that should be supported nationally. I understand with all the budget restrictions and many diseases, et cetera, that there's less and less available, particularly for these smaller, quotes, orphan diseases.
Well, we don't seem to have any luck in getting across the message that we're a cousin of multiple sclerosis, we're a cousin of lymphoma, we're a cousin of HIV. The same researcher could be doing our research with no extra salary or very little extra.
I totally agree with you, but it's a hard sell.
Yeah.
And it goes back to the stigma of CFS ME.
What do you think was key in our ending up with that stigma? The name or?
The name just trivialized the disease. I think really, to me, the lack of a clear-cut biological marker really held off researchers at one time. You know, short budget cycles, low dollar amounts. A small grant gets you nowhere with this disease.
Well,
And, you know, you need large numbers of patients, which is why I totally support the OMI and the idea of putting multiple physicians together and adding all our patients. I think if you're talking about things like genomic studies, it takes a large number of patients in order to get a sufficient number to for statistical validity. The same with treatment trials. You know, the very small treatment trials, it's very difficult to show efficacy in a small treatment trial.
is there any way to get people away from blood? I mean, HIV needed research in the lymph glands to really put the puzzle together.
Well, you know, the Ian Lipkin studies at Columbia are looking at other tissues. And I think he might be one of the first ones to do that with saliva and urine and
spinal.
Cerebral spinal fluid. And I really am excited about his research, and hopefully he will help us in terms of either biological markers or whether or not they have anything to do with pathogens. It may have to do with autoimmunity. It may have to do with signaling, with chemokines and cytokines. And I think, I know he's working on all those avenues. And we need people with his kind of expertise and quality to be researchers in this field. And that's a perfect example. His laboratory is not for chronic fatigue syndrome, but he has all of the equipment and personnel, statisticians to execute it and execute it very well.
Yeah, yeah. And that, of course, is Columbia, an academic medical center. But I think his prominence as a virus hunter probably is persuasive in moving along the board.
Yes.
And, well, final question. How have you stood it all these years? All the incredible frustrations from the CDC virtually walking out on you and ignoring you, to everything that has happened since, and plugging along in spite of an utter lack of support. At least recently it's improving, but how have you done it?
That's a question I get asked frequently, and the best answer I've come up with is that there is an essential truth that we still have to find. Remember, I saw perfectly healthy people become disabled. And nothing can ever convince me that that was not a pathophysiological process. And I expected answers long before this, but I'm still looking for answers. And the last few years, it's becoming clearer that there are immunological phenomena, et cetera. And the second thing is that discovery comes to the prepared mind. You know, we need intellectual curiosity. We need people who are asking questions about this and pursuing it. And it's evolved for me in terms of things like being more aggressive with my therapy, et cetera. So, and I haven't seen the end of this scenario yet, so that's why I'm still in the field.
This has come to you, and you feel that you have to follow the call. Is that fair?
That's fair to say.
Well, thank you very much for all your persistence, which has helped us all so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.